today's prophecy update, I'm probably going to do it in two parts, and I probably will record part 2 tomorrow morning on December 26th. That part will focus on Russia, Iran, what's going on in the country that we used to call Syria, and also some of the problems that are facing the European Union at the present time. This one's going to focus mainly on what happened at the UN Security Council this week. That's why I've titled this part UN Jackals. We talk each week about things converging, and it seems like each week they converge more quickly and they accelerate faster and faster, and so that you almost need to be checking things hourly now. A verse to just kind of start us off with in Romans chapter 1, verses 31 and 32, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. I wanted to update you on one thing. In the Sixth Circuit Highland School District, and this is covered pretty well by Ed Whalen over at the National Review. Ed talks about the Sixth Circuit's identity disorder. It's the case of Highland School District, located about 40 miles from downtown Columbus, versus the U.S. Department of Education. And the issue is Highland School District went and sought relief from the Department of Education rules that would require it to or allow a transgender student to use bathrooms in locker rooms of the sex with which this child identifies. I believe it's a boy who identifies as a girl wanting to use the girls' locker room, if I recall the case correctly. Judge Marbley, judge in the Southern District of Ohio, ruled that the Highland School District had to allow the child to use the bathrooms of the sex with which the child identifies. That case was appealed to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and at the Sixth Circuit level, the Highland School District asked the judges of the Sixth Circuit, it's assigned to a 3-judge panel, to issue a stay of the injunction that was issued by Judge Marbley. The Sixth Circuit refused. There's a good analysis in the dissenting opinion by Judge Sutton, who said that the injunction should be stayed pending review by the Sixth Circuit, and then if it's appealed to the Supreme Court, by the Supreme Court. It's clear that there is an agenda driving these things, and it's not based on the law. I've gone through this a lot of times in the past, a number of times in the past, where courts of Texas have said that the word sex in the civil rights statutes means not your sexual identity, but your actual sex, male or female. But that doesn't make any difference to the leftists in the Department of Education and the Department of Justice. They're going to impose their view, their feelings. And Judge Sutton was very clear that this was not something that he could agree with. And I think his analysis is much better than the majority's opinion. So you might want to take a look at that opinion. You can find that over at Ed Whalen's column at National Review. Of course, this is the Christmas season. There's a difference between how Christianity views this and how someone like ISIS views this time of year. Michael Ramirez has another great cartoon. Things are going so quickly that sometimes we don't even remember what happened just a week or two ago. It was only 2 weeks ago that there was an attack on a Coptic cathedral in Cairo that killed at least 25. And the problem is, throughout the Muslim world, and as we've seen in Germany this week, and as I'll talk about in my other update, we see these attacks happening with almost daily frequency. We don't even pay attention to the ones that happen in the Middle East, where there are sometimes dozens of people, upwards of 80, 90, 100 people killed in bombings on what seems almost like a daily basis. This attack in Cairo was particularly brutal. Some of the pictures I can't even show you as to what happened to people and how they were killed when this bomb exploded in this church. Newsweek has a rather, I would call it a disheartening, it's a derogatory article referring to Trump, President-elect Trump, as the Orange Messiah. There's things that he wants to do, though, with regard to Israel and Jerusalem that has the left in just an absolute uproar. The Economist has an article this week called An American Embassy in Jerusalem. And they note in this article that while he's not the first presidential candidate to promise to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, there was an act passed by Congress in 1995 authorizing that to occur. It is clear, though, that he appears to be the one who might actually do it. Here's what the Economist article said. Mr. Trump's representatives have, however, said he intends to move the embassy. Last week, he named David Friedman as ambassador to Israel. A bankruptcy lawyer, Mr. Friedman is an outspoken supporter of the Israeli far right, has donated money to Jewish settlements and occupied territories. And this, by the way, I'll talk a little bit about this later, but this term occupied territories is a complete misnomer. It is a complete legal fiction that's been adopted by virtually everybody, including the United States administration now, that this occupied territories is actually something that existed before the Six-Day War, before the 1948-49 war between Israel and the Arab armies. There was never a Palestine. There has never been a Palestine. And in order for there to be an occupied territory, it has to have actually existed as a separate legal entity before. It never has. So they're just very, very upset about David Friedman. I covered this a good bit in my update last week if you want to get some of the details about what Mr. Friedman has said in the past. But there are people that disagree. So let's look at this UN Security Council vote on the West Bank settlements. This was reported on Thursday. Now, there's been a concern about President Obama that's existed for quite some time, that President Obama would try to put in place some kind of deal that would harm Israel before he left office, and that he would do this between the election and the inauguration of the new president-elect. This week, I think he finally accomplished that. Now, on Thursday, Egypt put forth a resolution, it's Resolution 2334, that would essentially had a very negative comments, a negative determination about the Israeli settlements that have been built in the area that they call the West Bank. It's actually biblical Judea and Samaria. It's the mountains of Israel. It's actually the part of Israel that Ezekiel and other passages talk about as being the heartland of the Jewish people, and they want to give it away to someone else. And Ezekiel 35, 36 talk about this process, and that there will be people who will be making a claim to the mountains of Israel in the last days. I think that's pretty clearly prophesied in Ezekiel 35 and 36. So on Thursday, Egypt put forth this proposal, this UN resolution, or they said they were going to put it out. That caused a lot of people to leap into action. President-elect Trump intervened. Here's a copy of the draft resolution. It says things like, for example, condemning all measures aimed at altering the demographic composition, character, and status of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, including inter alia, the construction and expansion of settlements, transfer of Israeli settlers, confiscation of land, demolition of homes, and displacement of Palestinian civilians in violation of international humanitarian law and relevant resolutions. Now, this was very significant. This was going to be, if it was passed, the first time that the UN Security Council had adopted a resolution regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 7 or 8 years. In fact, during the entire term of the Obama administration. The resolution also said things that, for example, down the first page, recalling also the obligation under the Quartet Roadmap for the Palestinian Authority security forces to maintain effective operations aimed at confronting all those engaged in terror and dismantling terrorist capabilities, including the confiscation of illegal weapons. The people who were proposing this said, well, look, it's a very balanced approach. It has things both for Israel and for the Palestinians. But it was not a balanced approach. This has huge implications, and we'll talk about that. So President-elect Trump intervened, and there were calls made to the Egyptian government, I believe directly to al-Sisi, and asked them to withdraw the resolution. Now, I don't know what pressure was put on them, but Egypt withdrew the resolution. That was on Saturday, and so everybody was posting on Facebook, oh, look, everything's going to be postponed. It looks like everything's going to be fine. This may be postponed indefinitely. Well, that didn't last. Within a day, that resolution was put back in front of the UN General Assembly. Israel had been very grateful to President-elect Trump for intervening. As I said, Trump intervened directly with Sisi, the head of Egypt. What happened was, though, that it soon became apparent that on Friday, at least by Friday morning, it was apparent that 4 members, temporary members of the United Nations Security Council were going to advance this resolution 2334 to put a stop to the Israeli settlements. Now, you need to understand that in Israel right now, there is a bill making its way through the Knesset. I think the vote has been delayed, but it looks like it's going to pass, that would essentially approve of these settlements that have been built, as some people call them, beyond the 1967 lines, beyond the 1949 lines. But these have always been built, for the most part, in areas that everybody acknowledges that's been involved in negotiations between the Israeli government and the Palestinians, that Israel is going to get this land for security reasons and other reasons. There will be land swaps. But what this resolution does is essentially makes it illegal for Israel to build in Jerusalem, to build in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, which has always been occupied by Jews. And so anybody who says that this resolution doesn't really do that much, it does do a lot. It changes things on the ground. It makes all of that illegal. Now, whether they would enforce it or not is anybody's guess, but what it does is it puts a complete monkey wrench in any negotiations with the Palestinians, because they're now locked into having a two-state solution that's based on the 1967 or 1949 borders. Those borders have been called the Auschwitz borders because it will result in effectively a Jewish state that cannot be defended. So the Security Council was going to vote on Friday. Then what happened was the vote came up in the UN on Friday, about 3 p.m. The vote took place, and the United States, for the first time in its history, this is unprecedented, abstained from voting. In the past, when these resolutions have come before the UN Security Council, the United States has consistently and always vetoed these resolutions. But in a parting shot at Israel, Obama decided that they would abstain from voting on this particular resolution, with the result that this resolution, which was advanced by Malaysia, New Zealand, Senegal, and I believe Morocco, mainly and we'll talk a little bit about New Zealand's involvement in this because I think there's some connection there. It passed 14-0. And of course, it immediately hit all the papers that this was a major rebuff to Israel. It would allow the UN to demand Israel to stop building settlements beyond these 1967 and 1949 lines. The only abstention, of course, was Samantha Powers, the ambassador to the United States. And here she is raising her hand to abstain from the voting. And this was huge news. I mean, the New York Times devoted the better part of 2 pages in its Saturday issue to this particular topic. And it was clear, even the New York Times, which, as you know, is left-wing, they noted that this was a final clash in the relationship between Netanyahu and Obama. Here's a little clip of the actual declaration of the vote of the resolution.
El resultado de la votación es el siguiente: 14 votos a favor, 1 abstención. Queda aprobado el proyecto de resolución como resolución 2334.
And this was Spain, who's the president of the UN Security Council right now. But this is significant. This has prophetic implications to it because now, and while there have been hundreds of resolutions that are anti-Israel adopted, this one is a little bit different because it's taking place at the UN Security Council level. And for the first time in history, the United States has essentially refused to support Israel. And this is a clear slap in the face to the United States-Israel relationship by President Obama and his administration. In Joel chapter 3, it says this: "For behold, in those days and in that time when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land." Dividing the land of Israel is against what God wants to do. Similarly, in Zechariah chapter 14, verse 2, it says that in the end times, he will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. So this Armageddon campaign that we talk about in the end times will be really a battle against Jerusalem and the Jewish people. Zechariah 2, verse 8 says, "For thus saith the Lord of hosts, after the glory hath he sent me unto the nations which spoiled you, for he that toucheth you toucheth the apple of his eye." Well, the resolution passed. Drudge reported it as a backstabbing of Israel. Donald Trump issued a tweet almost immediately that said, I think the vote took place a little bit after 3, and by 3:15, he had tweeted, "As to the UN, things will be different after January 20th. It'll be very difficult, though, to overturn this resolution. There are other things that Trump can do. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Here is, I believe this is Samantha Power talking about, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about this lady in a moment. I've covered this before, but it bears mentioning who she is and where she comes from. So here's Samantha Power talking about the adoption of the resolution.
Let me begin with a quote. "The United States will not support the use of any additional land for the purpose of settlements during the transitional period. Indeed, the immediate adoption of a settlement freeze by Israel, more than any other action, could create the confidence needed for wider participation in these talks. Further settlement activity is in no way necessary for the security of Israel and only diminishes the confidence of the Arabs that a final outcome can be freely and fairly negotiated." That's the end of the quote. This was said in 1982 by President Ronald Reagan.
Well, if President Reagan said that, and I believe that he did. He had a Secretary of State, James Baker, who had a very upside-down view, incorrect view of Israel and the relation that the United States should have with Israel. So it's hard to say that Reagan was a complete, full-bore supporter of the Jewish state of Israel. Samantha Power continued with her comments in support of the United States abstention, which allowed this resolution to be approved. The United States could have vetoed it.
Yet rather than dismantling these and other settler outposts, which are illegal even under Israeli law, now there is new legislation advancing in the Israeli Knesset that would legalize most of the outposts, a factor that propelled the decision by this resolution sponsors to bring it before the Council. The Israeli Prime Minister recently described his government as, quote, more committed to settlements than any in Israel's history, end quote. And one of his leading coalition partners recently declared that, quote, the era of the two-state solution is over, end quote. At the same time, the Prime Minister has said that he is still committed to pursuing a two-state solution. But these statements are irreconcilable. One cannot simultaneously champion expanding Israeli settlements and champion a viable two-state solution that would end the conflict. One has to make a choice between settlements and separation. Since 2011, multiple efforts to pursue peace through negotiations have failed. And since 2011, President Obama and Secretary Kerry have repeatedly warned, publicly and privately, that the absence of progress toward peace and continued settlement expansion was going to put the two-state solution at risk and threaten Israel's stated objective to remain both a Jewish state and a democracy. We have to recognize that Israel faces very serious threats in a very tough neighborhood. Israelis are rightfully concerned about making sure there is not a new terrorist haven next door. President Obama and this administration have shown an unprecedented commitment to Israel's security because that is what we believe in. Our commitment to that security has never wavered, and it never will. Even with a financial crisis and budget deficits, we repeatedly increase funding to support Israel's military. And in September, the Obama administration signed a memorandum of understanding to provide $38 billion in security assistance to Israel over the next 10 years, the largest single pledge of military assistance in U.S. history to any country. And as the Israeli Prime Minister himself has noted, our military and intelligence cooperation is unprecedented. We believe, though, that continued settlement building seriously undermines Israel's security. Some may cast the U.S. vote as a sign that we have finally given up on a two-state solution. Nothing could be further from the truth. None of us can give up on a two-state solution. We continue to believe that that solution is the only viable path to provide peace and security for the State of Israel and freedom and dignity for the Palestinian people.
Now, you need to understand who Samantha Powers is. She was one of the early foreign policy advisors to President Obama in the 2008 election cycle. There is a picture of her with her husband, who she married in 2008, a man named Cass Sunstein, who is a law professor now at Harvard, but also served in a representative capacity for the Obama administration during the first few years of its existence. He is a man of the left. He is, I would call him, leaning to the radical left. Samantha Power herself is part of what I would call the radical left. She wrote a book that actually won a Pulitzer Prize called A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. And it won the Pulitzer Prize in 2003. She has subsequently been a professor at Harvard herself, and she came back to she was with the Obama administration in the early days, left, went to Harvard, and then came back to become the ambassador to the United States. She is a leftist, and she has some very odd views. As a result, in 2002 or 3, she was interviewed on a television program for the University of California at Berkeley, and she talked about how she might handle the Middle East situation. The questioner said, well, if it looks like both parties are moving to genocide, the Palestinians are going to kill the Jews and the Jews are going to kill the Palestinians, how would you handle it? And this is essentially her. This is not essentially her answer. This is actually how she answered that question.
I don't think that in any of the cases a shortage of information is the problem. And I actually think in the Palestine-Israeli situation, there's an abundance of information. And what we don't need is some kind of early warning mechanism there. What we need is a willingness to actually put something on the line in service of helping the situation. And putting something on the line might mean alienating a domestic constituency of tremendous political and financial import. It may more crucially mean sacrificing or investing, I think more than sacrificing, literally billions of dollars not in servicing Israelis, military, but actually in investing in the new state of Palestine, in investing billions of dollars it would probably take also to support, I think, what will have to be a mammoth protection force, not of the old, Srebrenica kind or the Rwanda kind, but a meaningful military presence, because it seems to me at this stage, and this is true of actual genocides as well, and not just major human rights abuses, which we're seeing there, but is that you have to go in as if you're serious. You have to put something on the line, and unfortunately, imposition of a solution on unwilling parties is dreadful. I mean, it's a terrible thing to do. It's fundamentally undemocratic. But sadly, we don't just have a democracy here either. We have a liberal democracy. There are certain sets of principles that guide, our policy, or that are meant to anyway. And there, it's essential that some set of principles becomes the best benchmark, rather than a deference to people who are fundamentally politically destined to destroy the lives of their own people. And by that I mean what Tom Friedman has called Sharafat. I do think in that sense there's that both political leaders have been dreadfully irresponsible, and unfortunately it does require external intervention, which very much like the Rwanda scenario, that thought experiment, if we had intervened early, any intervention is going to come under fierce criticism. But we have to think about lesser evils, especially when the human stakes are just becoming ever more pronounced.
So what she's saying there are a couple things. One is she draws an equivalency between the then leader of Israel, Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, and Yasser Arafat. She called them sort of jointly Sharafat because to her they're the same. They're morally equivalent. Arafat is the same as Sharon. Sharon is the same as Arafat. This is leftist nonsense. And this is the kind of thing, though, that gets you a Pulitzer Prize in today's time. The other thing she said that was significant is that essentially, to enforce this peace, we're going to have to invade Israel. This is a stunning thing for her to say. I mean, I don't think there's hardly anybody that says that we're going to need to invade Israel to enforce the peace. But I think you can understand the prophetic implications of someone who is in a position of power and influence, not only with the president, but internationally, that holds these views, and how they stack up with what we are told will happen with a world leader in the end times who will come into the Holy Land and pitch his tents there. That's what's talked about in Daniel chapter 11. So I want to impress upon you the prophetic significance of the things that have been going on in the background. This is an interview from 14 years ago. That this is the view of the left. This is a view of a lot of people in the State Department. And this is where I think that even though, President Trump is coming in, and I hope he's successful, there's a lot of people in the State Department that want to push for exactly the things that further a globalist agenda and an agenda which forces some kind of peace agreement upon the Jewish state of Israel. I think that is prophetically significant. Melanie Phillips, at her blog, melaniephillips.com, has an article that she wrote, came out yesterday, called Obama's Malice May Shame Drain the UN Swamp. here's what she said. There's another country, however, whose behavior over this resolution must be noted with grim dismay. And she's talking about Great Britain. We can forget New Zealand, this stupid country of no other significance. As one of the 5 permanent Security Council members, Britain could have vetoed the resolution. Instead, it actually supported it. Now, a lot of people will think, well, this is Great Britain gave us the Balfour Declaration. They're a supporter of Israel. Theresa May went and gave a speech last week. I played you clips of it to the Christian Friends of Israel organization in Great Britain. But the question is, does Israel really support, does Great Britain actually support the Jewish state of Israel? And the answer is, I don't think so. Since she came to power last July, Melanie continues, the British Prime Minister Theresa May has gone out of her way to express, this is a direct quotes lifted from her article, has gone out of her way to express her warm affection for the Jewish people and her strong support for the state of Israel. Her words now stick in the throat. If Obama has committed a foul and final act of malice towards Israel, Mrs. May has done something just as bad, if not worse. Presented herself as the friend upon whom the Jewish people can rely, while her government stuck the knife not into Israel's back as it did Obama, but its front. 2 weeks ago, Mrs. May told the Conservative Friends of Israel that the 1917 Balfour Declaration, in which the British government committed itself to the reestablishment of the Jewish homeland in Palestine, was one of the most important letters in history, and that next year's anniversary of the declaration was one that Britain would be marking with pride. Yesterday at the UN, making common cause with ideologues, appeasers, and tyrants, perfidious Albion continued its betrayal of the Jewish people. The scene is now set for the U.S. to tackle the reservoir of evil that the UN has become, not before time. This is one swamp that most urgently needs to be drained. And here is the ambassador of Great Britain justifying Great Britain's support of Resolution 2334.
The United Kingdom welcomes the adoption of Resolution 2334 today. It's the first Security Council resolution on the Israel-Palestine issue in over 7 years. The adoption of this resolution is first and foremost a clear reinforcement of the international community's conviction that a two-state solution remains the only viable route to sustained Arab-Israeli peace.
So, they're committed to the two-state solution. They voted in favor of this resolution, which has huge implications, and we'll talk about that. In response to the vote, Israeli Ambassador Danny Danon had this to say.
Just 2 months ago, UNESCO approved an absurd resolution denying the connection between the Jewish people and Jerusalem. Today, this Council, including many of the world's leading democracies, the beacons of liberty, voted to condemn the state of Israel. You voted to condemn the Jewish people for building homes in the land of Israel. You voted to ban us from building in our historical capital of Jerusalem, the heart and soul of the Jewish people. Read the resolution. Tomorrow night, Israel and the entire Jewish community around the world will celebrate the holiday of Hanukkah. Over 2,000 years ago, King Antiochus banished the Jewish people from our temple in Jerusalem and issued decrees trying to sever us from religion and our heritage. But we prevailed. The Jewish people fought back. We regained our independence and relight the menorah candles in the temples. I ask each and every member of this council who voted for this resolution, who gave you the right to issue such a decree, denying our eternal rights in Jerusalem? Would this council have had the nerve to condemn your country for building homes in your capital? Would you ban the French from building in Paris? Would you ban the Russians from building in Moscow? Would you ban the Chinese from building in Beijing? Would you ban the British from building in London? Would you ban the Americans from building in Washington? We overcame those decrees during the time of the Maccabees, and we will overcome this evil decree today. We have full confidence in the justice of our cause and in the righteousness of our path. We will continue to be a democratic state based on the rule of law and full civil and human rights for all our citizens, and we will continue to be a Jewish state, proudly reclaiming the land of our forefathers, where the Maccabees fought their oppressors and King David ruled from Jerusalem. This holy book, the Bible, contains 3,000 years of history of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. No one can change this history.
What this resolution does is it says that Jesus was sort of, and Mary and Joseph were out of place going into what is now Bethlehem, which is part of the, quote, occupied territory. It's an absurd notion. It makes no sense. It shows, I think, part of the delusion that we'll see in the end times. It's just so clearly a delusion. But it's interesting that Ambassador Danan makes a connection to the Maccabees in his rebuttal of the adoption of this resolution. And that is a significant period. That is the event, the Maccabees' opposition to what was going on in the temple in Jerusalem under the Seleucid Empire, which was controlling Israel at the time. They fought against it, and there was this miracle of the menorah. It just didn't go out. They only had enough oil for a certain period of time, and it lasted for 8 days. It should have only lasted for 1 or 2, I believe. And that has led to the feast of Hanukkah, the feast of, I think, more properly called the Feast of Rededication. And I did a teaching recently on Daniel 11 and 12 called the Maskalim. You can find it on our YouTube channel, where I talk about the significance of Hanukkah. And I also did something probably 3 years ago around the holiday Christmas time, talking about a future Hanukkah. You might look that up. I think it was in December of 2013. You can look through the videos on our channel. It is interesting that this vote happened right at, and this is a kind of an unusual year where Christmas and Hanukkah sort of happen at the same time. It happens every 20 years, 19 or 20 years. And so in the year that this convergence of events happens, there is this anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic resolution adopted that ignores history and facts as to the connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. It is also interesting, and I will say, qualify this as I haven't been able to confirm it, but a trusted friend of mine sent me something this morning, and I had so much material to go through that I have not had time to verify this. But I was told that the reading, what they read, the Jews read at the beginning of Hanukkah, comes from the Psalms. And I want you to put it into the context of what is going on this year. A resolution that essentially encapsulates the world's denial that the Jews have any right to that land, and that significant areas of that land where biblical history took place, and as Danny Danon held up the Bible and said, for 3,000 years, this book proves that the Jewish people have had a connection to the land of Israel and to the city of Jerusalem, and essentially denies the Jewishness of Jesus Christ. So in that context, I want you to look at what I understand to be the verse that they read at the beginning of Hanukkah. It says this, from Psalm 27. That's the Hebrew portion. That's what the verse looks like in Hebrew. And it says this, a psalm of David, Yahweh, the Lord, is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Now, when you unpack that verse, my salvation is the word Yeshua. The connection of Jesus to the feast, the light of the world, to the feast of Hanukkah, cannot be denied. Well, there was a lot of reaction to the adoption of this resolution. This is from the New York Post. Obama betrayed Israel. Bibi got Barack stabbed, and Obama's betrayal like act of war. Some of the reaction was pretty stunning. Here's a sort of a summary of some of the reactions and the defense of what they did by the Obama White House from Fox News special report the other night.
The White House moved quickly to explain why it did what it did. Correspondent Kevin Cork is traveling with President Obama in Hawaii and reports from Honolulu. Hello, Kevin.
Yeah, you're right on the money, Shannon. The president made this decision by himself, but not after close consultation with key members of his inner circle, including Vice President Joe Biden, Secretary of State John Kerry, National Security Advisor Susan Rice, and UN Ambassador Samantha Power. It's also important to point out what Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes had to say about this today. He said, listen, the abstention vote was preferred because the UN hasn't exactly been impartial on this issue.
When it comes to final status issues, we believe that those should be negotiated between the parties.
Rhodes repeating the assertion that the president's done more for Israel's security than any other U.S. president, noting the $38 billion military aid package signed very recently. But when asked whether he thought Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was committed to peace, Rhodes sounded a bit skeptical.
And at a certain point, the words and the actions become irreconcilable. And that's what we're concerned about.
Meanwhile, Secretary of State John Kerry said today the United States acted with one primary objective in mind: to preserve the possibility of the two-state solution. He went on to add, while we do not agree with every aspect of this resolution, it rightly condemns the violence and incitement and settlement activity and calls on both sides to take constructive steps to reverse current trends and advance the prospects for a two-state solution.
And I would say to Secretary of State Kerry, if it's not a perfect resolution, then use your veto power that you have as a permanent member of the UN Security Council to veto this nonsense and get a perfect resolution in there that will accomplish your objectives. This one does not. This one completely undermines a peace process. It completely undermines the Jewish state of Israel. It's a farce. Secretary Kerry is a farce. Ben Rhodes is a farce. They are leftists that have lost the ability to reason. They can't even see how stupid their actions are. And there's an advantage. If January 20th means anything, it means that Ben Rhodes and John Kerry and Barack Obama and Samantha Power are leaving, and they won't have anything to do with the government anymore. Oh, they'll still try to exert their influence, but they won't be in positions of power where they can actually do damage. Well, the Washington Post even came out and said this was a dangerous parting shot, that Obama's administration's move on the UN Security Council resolution could do more harm than good. I agree 100% with that. Elliot Abrams has written a couple of articles. Peace just got harder in the Middle East. And then also in the Weekly Standard, an article that I'll quote from in just a moment, Obama's disgraceful and harmful legacy on Israel. Here is some comments from former UN Ambassador John Bolton, who is still under consideration, I believe, to be Deputy Secretary of State in the Trump administration, and his comments on what the adoption of this resolution means.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is reacting by saying, quote, Israel rejects the shameful anti-Israel resolution at the UN and will not abide by its terms. Netanyahu adding, quote, the Obama administration not only failed to protect Israel against this gang up at the UN, it colluded with it behind the scenes. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is reacting by saying, quote, Israel rejects the shameful anti-Israel resolution at the UN.
Well, that was Prime Minister Netanyahu's reaction to the adoption of the resolution. Here is a former ambassador, John Bolton's thoughts on the subject.
Well, I really think this was an effort to box the incoming Trump administration in, and it violates nearly 50 years of American bipartisan policy on the Middle East, going back to the iconic Resolution 242 after the 1967 war, which established the principle of land for peace. This resolution says basically Israel's occupation is illegitimate, therefore it has no land to give back in exchange for peace. Contrary to what the Obama administration has said, this puts a huge thumb on the scale against Israel. It does go to final status. It does affect Israel's security. It undermines it in profound ways. The consequences of this resolution are going to be felt for many, many years, all negative on Israel and substantially negative on the United States itself. This subject of what Barack Obama might do with respect to Israel during the post-election, pre-inauguration period has been the subject of discussions that I've participated in for 2 years or more. It was entirely foreseeable, and now we see the consequences. This, I do think, actually, contrary to what Obama said, is the death knell of the so-called two-state solution. Because it shows, once again, it is fundamentally unworkable. And I think Netanyahu and a nearly unanimous Israeli public opinion will support him on that. With respect to the United States, I think it's time to stand up for a principle I've certainly advocated for a long time, which is votes in the United Nations should have consequences. We've got two issues here: the 14 countries that voted in favor of this resolution and the United Nations as a whole. Personally, what I would recommend to the President-elect would be, once he takes office, he should say this resolution is illegitimate and the United States is going to seek to repeal it. Now, if that fails, and that's the most likely outcome, we should cut our contribution to the United Nations, perhaps in toto, until this resolution is repealed.
This is an interesting concept, Ambassador Bolton. Right now, we account for somewhere around 20 to 22% of the total budget of the UN. So you're suggesting if the resolution isn't repealed, then we go ahead and pull the 20% of their budget?
Yeah, look, my experience with the United Nations, which goes back a long way, is that there are only two aspects of American power that are really respected in the United Nations. One is the veto in the Security Council, which Barack Obama threw away today, and the other is our money. I've personally engaged in telling specialized agencies in the UN and others that if something happens contrary to our wishes, we'll cut the money off. We have done that. It's just extremely distressing that even Great Britain didn't abstain on this resolution, and it shows just how much difficulty there is in the United Nations to try and carry out a coherent American foreign policy.
The reaction of the Jewish left, the Israel left, was about what you would expect. Isaac Herzog said, Netanyahu has lost control. The man who a month ago told us the world was worshiping us declared war this evening against the world, the United States and Europe, and is trying to calm us with lies. We're all likely to feel this dangerous madness, all citizens of Israel, right or left wing, on our next visit abroad with hostile treatment. He's a leftist, which means he's an idiot. Zionist Union number 2 and former Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni said that it was Netanyahu's personal failure and that he knew and said clearly that the settlement regulation bill will bring about a Security Council resolution, and nonetheless conceded to the radical right. Ben Rhodes, some additional quotes of his. We've tried everything, Rhodes told the Jerusalem Post, noting that U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has tried for years to bring both parties to the negotiating table and to convince Israel to end or at least pause construction in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which Palestinians argue as a chief obstacle to peace talks. Here we are, he said, at least trying to establish that the international community is on the record. Asked what the president thought that the motion, Resolution 2334, would accomplish and whether the administration feared it was forcing Republicans entering power to react, Rhodes described the move as a last resort reached after years of struggling with an intractable Israeli government. Where is the evidence that not doing this will slow the settlement construction? We've tried a different approach for years here, Rhodes asked, noting that the resolution, which states that Israeli settlements have no basis in law, also condemns incitement to violence by Palestinian leadership. Quoting Rhodes, "We would have vetoed any resolution that we thought sought to impose a solution that sought to impose a view on the final status issue." That's just absolute, that's just a bold-faced lie. Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League had a different view. The ADL is outraged over the U.S. failure to veto this biased and unconstructive UN Security Council resolution on Israel. He continued, the Obama administration repeatedly stated that a solution to the conflict cannot be imposed on the parties but must be achieved directly by the parties themselves. It is too deeply troubling that this biased resolution appears to be the final word of the administration on this issue. The Jewish Federation of North America said this: "It is tragic that the administration chose to mar its legacy of support for the Jewish state and set back the prospects for Israeli-Palestinian peace." President Obama has consistently supported Israel's right to self-defense and affirmed that America has an ironclad commitment to make sure Israel is secure. And these people are supporters of Obama, and they've walked it back. Now to the article of Elliot Abrams in the Weekly Standard. Now, I think this is significant. I think it's important. That's why I'm going to read a pretty long passage from it. For all 8 years of the Obama administration, Democrats have made believe that Barack Obama is a firm and enthusiastic supporter and defender of the Jewish state. Arguments to the contrary were not only dismissed but angrily denounced as the products of nothing more than vicious partisanship. Obama's defenders repeatedly used the trope that Israel should not be a partisan issue, as if Obama's views and actions were beyond reproach. A whole core of Jewish leaders, some at the major organizations and many from Chicago, showed far greater loyalty to Obama than to the tradition of true nonpartisanship when it came to Middle East policy. All of those arguments have been ground into dust by Obama's action Friday, allowing a nasty and harmful anti-Israel resolution to pass the UN Security Council. Just weeks before leaving office, he could not resist the opportunity to take one more swipe at Israel and to do real harm. So he will leave with his record on Israel in ruins, and he will leave Democrats even worse off. It's pretty clear that he does not care. Does a resolution matter? It does. The text declares that the establishment by Israel of settlements in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, has no legal validity and constitutes a flagrant violation under international law. This may turn both settlers, even those in major blocks like Ma'ale Adumim, that everyone knows Israel will keep in any peace deal, and Israeli officials into criminals in some countries, subject to prosecution there or in the International Criminal Court. It effectively will limit the right of a lot of them to travel freely internationally. The text of the resolution demands that Israel immediately and completely cease all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. That would include the Jewish quarter of the Old City. Now add to this wording to the previous line, and it means that even construction in the Jewish quarter of the Old City is a flagrant violation under international law. The resolution also calls upon all states to distinguish in their relevant dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the territories occupied since 1967. This is a call to boycott products of the Golan, the West Bank, and parts of Jerusalem, and support the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, the BDS movement. Obama has done us one favor, which is to settle the long argument about his attitude towards Israel. No partisan of his, no apologetic Democrat can henceforth say with a straight face that we've been hearing for years about him. That what we've been hearing for years about him is not true. In 2012, for example, Thomas Friedman wrote in the New York Times, the only question I have when it comes to President Obama and Israel is whether he is the most pro-Israel president in history or just one of the most. Sorry, Tom. Statements like that are now simply embarrassing. Obama has done what he could for 8 years to undermine Israel's elected government, prevent its action against Iran's nuclear program, and create as much daylight as possible between the United States and Israel. It's a great article. You ought to go look it up. I didn't read all of it, but it's there. Netanyahu had his own response. He's called all of the ambassadors of the countries on the UN Security Council to appear before him in Jerusalem. There's some that are obviously out for the holidays, but he met with at least 10 of them in the last 24 hours to scold them through underlings as to what they have done. They've recalled their ambassador, I believe, from New Zealand. They have cut off funding to various UN organizations immediately and aid to the countries that were on the UN Security Council. Here is a statement from Netanyahu. I'll let you read the closed captions given in Hebrew within the past day in Jerusalem. Citizens of Israel, I would like to reassure you the resolution that was adopted yesterday at the UN is distorted and shameful, but we will overcome it. The resolution determines that the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem is occupied territory. This is delusional. The resolution determines that the Western Wall is occupied territory. This too is delusional. There's nothing more absurd than calling the Western Wall and the Jewish quarter occupied territory. There is also an attempt here, which will not succeed, to impose permanent settlement terms on Israel. You might recall that the last one who tried to do this was Carter, an extremely hostile president to Israel who just recently said that Hamas is not a terrorist organization. Carter passed sweeping decisions against us at the UN of a similar kind, and this was also unsuccessful. We opposed this, and nothing happened. All American presidents since Carter upheld the American commitment not to try to dictate permanent settlement terms to Israel at the Security Council. And yesterday, in complete contradiction of this commitment, including an explicit commitment by President Obama himself in 2011, the Obama administration carried out a shameful anti-Israel ploy at the UN. I would like to tell you that the resolution that was adopted not only does it bring peace closer, it drives it further away. It hurts justice, it hurts the truth. Think about this absurdity. 500,000 human beings are being slaughtered in Syria. Tens of thousands are being butchered in Sudan. The entire Middle East is going up in flames, and the Obama administration and the Security Council choose to gang up on the only democracy in the Middle East, the State of Israel. What a disgrace. My friends, I would like to tell you on the first night of Hanukkah that this will not avail them. We reject this resolution outright, just as we rejected the UN resolution that determined that Zionism was racism. It took time, but that resolution was rescinded. It will take time, but this one will also be rescinded. I'm not so sure I agree with him on that. We'll have to see what happens. It'll be very, very difficult to get it rescinded, and it will take some time. Caroline Glick has a great Facebook post. She had an article on Friday in the Jerusalem Post, and it's kind of irrelevant now because at the time it looked like the vote on this resolution was going to be put off. But listen to what she says in this Facebook post, and then I think I have some video clip of her being interviewed yesterday, and then a little bit of review of how this thing came about. So it should be about another 10 minutes or so. She says this: Land for Peace formed the basis of UN Security Council Resolution 242 from the end of the 1967 Six-Day War. It stipulated an exchange for Arab recognition of Israel and peace with the Jewish state. Israel would cede some of the land that it took control over during the course of that war. But Friday's resolution says that Israel has no right to any of the land, that the presence of the Israelis in that land, yes, including the Western Wall, is illegal. So Israel has no land to give, and the Arabs will give no peace, and that is that. The other thing that the resolution does is annul all the bilateral agreements that Israel signed with the PLO, which formed the basis of their peace process. Those agreements were all witnessed by the US, the EU, and Russia. And those agreements committed the sides to the bilateral framework for resolving their conflict. Friday's resolution makes zero mention of any of those agreements. It pretended that they don't exist, and in so doing, it killed them all. They are dead. For 23 years, confined by the Oslo framework, Israel was wary of taking the unilateral step of applying its law to all or parts of Judea and Samaria, just as it was wary of building new Jewish communities in those areas. But now that those agreements are dead, Israel has no such limitations on its actions. It can act unilaterally just as it did in the past. The greatest victims of this resolution are not Israeli Jews. They are the Jews of the diaspora, and particularly Jews in the West. Harassment of Jews in the US, Canada, and Europe by Muslim thugs and their useful leftist idiots, both on and off campus, will rise as a result of this resolution. There's an ironic silver lining to this resolution for Israel. First, there's the obvious silver lining which is that we don't need to lie about Obama anymore. He revealed himself in his final month as the Jew-hating, Israel-hating bastard we have always known him to be, but our leaders, out of fear that he would act as he did on Friday, felt compelled to pretend that the man who gave the bomb to Iran is a friend of ours. Second, and more importantly, there is the irony of the consequences of the resolution. By joining the UN gang rape of Israel in an act of diplomatic terrorism against the Jewish people and the Jewish state, Obama destroyed not only all prospects for peace, he destroyed all prospects for a Palestinian state. He destroyed all prospects for Israeli withdrawal to the 1949 armistice lines. He destroyed all prospect of any Israeli withdrawal at all. And he even managed to weaken the UN, which now faces a massive cut in funding from the Trump White House and the Republican-controlled Congress. The news of this resolution hit us like a brick wall. It hurts to see a room full of well-dressed, well-schooled, supposedly cultured, and caring people act like a lynch mob of Cossacks setting fire to synagogues and attacking Jewish villagers with pitchforks. It is nauseating beyond measure to watch Samantha Power, who branded herself as Miss Genocide, as in the redhead who fights for the powerless, standing with murderers against the innocent, law-abiding, human rights-respecting, good Jews. But we've been through much worse and survived and prospered. Samantha Power won't even merit a footnote in history except in the section on the greatest hypocrites in the early 21st century. Obama will go on to become Jimmy Carter on steroids. He will be relentless and powerful, but we will survive him as well. And John Kerry will be remembered first and foremost for betraying the men that served with him in Vietnam. All the treacheries he committed since, including this one, were preordained the moment he stepped out of the crowd and libeled his brothers in arms. With God's help, we Jews will survive and thrive and move on from strength to strength as our forefathers did, as we have always done. Caroline did a little Facebook Live interview. Here's just a couple clips from that.
So what we saw on Thursday when Mubarak pulled his... when when Assisi pulled the resolution and the Arab League backed his decision, most importantly,
I didn't even notice that.
yes, they did. We see the harvest of the very successful foreign policy revolution that Obama forced Israel to enact under Netanyahu. And then, we got the old world standing up and saying no, and this won't stand on Friday, when the United States colluded with the likes of Venezuela and Malaysia and Senegal and New Zealand to do what the Arabs wouldn't do to Israel.
Right. So you're hinting upon this, but I'm going to ask you the question that everyone's asking themselves right now.
What's that?
Straight out. How bad is this for Israel, and how much of an opportunity is this for the benefit of Israel moving forward?
Well, this is a very big hit for Israel. I mean, it gives a backwind to the BDS movement. When that clause, which was written very specifically in order to harm us, that people should make a distinction between Israel within the 1949 armistice lines and Israel outside of them, when their dealings with Israel, it was a call for BDS. And, there's even a clause in there that says that a rapporteur should be returning to the Security Council with reports every 3 months about the implementation of this. So this is going to be a constant headache for Israel. And it is going to empower the BDS movement. On the other hand, it's going to empower the people who don't need to be empowered anyway because they're moving forward with this. And I think when you look at this against the context of what the Republican-controlled Congress is likely to do with the support of the Trump administration to curb BDS, both in their trade relations with the European Union, which is sort of the epicenter of the state BDS movement, and also in relationship to their funding decisions about U.S. universities that allow BDS terror campaigns to be conducted on their campuses. And you're going to see that, you have this declarative statement from the UN Security Council, but on a policy and substantive level, it's going to become, as a practical matter, far more difficult for states to conduct these kinds of operations against Israel than it has been for the past 8 years, and it's going to become a matter of great difficulty for university campuses to enable the terrorization of Jewish students and the libeling of Israel on their campuses. From an Israeli perspective, one of the positive aspects of this terrible thing is that it really empowers us to finally call Obama what he is, which is an anti-Semite and an anti-Israel president and the most hostile president that we've had. I mean, this is a man who just said that the Wailing Wall is occupied Palestinian territory. This is a man who just said that it's illegal for Jews to be born in Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem, in the Golan Heights. I mean, he just made it a crime to be Jewish in these areas. This is an appalling act of anti-Semitism, and I think that because we were worried about him shooting this gun, right? We've paid lip service to his supposed friendship for Israel for 8 years, when really he has been acting in a hostile manner. Again, like I said, since the outset of his presidency. So. That is a good thing.
Well, just in wrapping up, how did this come about? And the Wall Street Journal yesterday, I think the link to the article, although it may require a subscription, is in the description notes, along with a lot of the other articles that I reviewed to put this together. Talked about the frantic path to the UN vote on this particular resolution. As I said, on Thursday, it looked like it was dead. It was going to be postponed indefinitely, but then it came back on Friday. Mainly at I think the lead country bringing this to the fore was New Zealand. Now look, the people of New Zealand are great, the government not so much. But the interesting thing, and there's an article in the Jerusalem Post, which I may or may not have linked to, that talks about there was something that happened when Kerry went to New Zealand in November. He was there. He went to Antarctica. Before he went to Antarctica, he stopped briefly in New Zealand and had some meeting with government officials. After he went to Antarctica, he came back and he went to Wellington and he met with Prime Minister Key of New Zealand. It's also clear, too, that about a week and a half ago, December 12th, he met with the lead Palestinian negotiator in this so-called peace process. But what was interesting, we don't know exactly what was talked about between Key and Kerry on November 13th. I suspect that part of it was talking about how this resolution might be brought forward in the event that other countries decline to move it forward into the UN Security Council. New Zealand, I believe, will be leaving the Security Council soon, and this was a way for them to seem significant. The interesting thing is that around the time that Kerry left New Zealand, they had this massive earthquake, if you recall, that happened in Christchurch. It was epicentered in Christchurch. It was a 7.8 earthquake, and you see the film there, some of the damage on one of the coastal roads and the landslides that occurred as a result of this earthquake in New Zealand. It caused really a lot of damage on some cut off parts of the island from other parts of the island because of the damage to the road. You see the landslide there. It's going to take a while to clean this up. There's actually a road under there. There it is now, you can see it. And this is going to be a problem for New Zealand. Now, one of the other things that was noted was that I believe that the Obama administration had been telegraphing that they were going to do this. And as you recall, we've talked a lot about this in our updates over the past couple of months about what will Obama do. He was not going to do anything before the election because it might erode Jewish support for Hillary Clinton. So, but between the election, when he's a lame duck, between the election and the swearing in on January 20th, there's been a concern that Obama was going to do something, that he might actually come out and vote like Great Britain did in favor of a resolution like this. But he felt he can get away with it politically if he just refused to exercise the veto, if he just abstained from voting. It's everybody knows what he did, and everybody knows why he did it. But John Kerry gave a speech right after he got back from New Zealand, or a talk at the Saban Forum. Haim Saban is a multi-billionaire, owns Univision, the Mexican channel, or the Spanish language channel, very, very wealthy, big supporter of Democratic Party. And in his talk, Kerry referenced politicians, and it's clear that he was referencing things that were said at the Jerusalem Post diplomatic conference in the week before Thanksgiving, particularly by Naftali Bennett. You can look that up on YouTube, Naftali Bennett's speech. I've played clips of it in my updates, but I think you should go listen to the whole speech because it is sort of like this is who John Kerry is referencing in this clip from his talk or conversation with Jeffrey Goldberg at the Saban Forum.
So the question for all of us is not the road we've traveled for the last 100 years. The question is, what are the next 100 years going to look like? Where are we going?
Now, I want you to compare what he says with what Samantha Powers said in her talk that I played earlier.
And let me tell you a few things that I've learned for sure in the last few years. There will be no separate peace between Israel and the Arab world. I want to make that very clear to all of you. I've heard several prominent politicians in Israel sometimes saying, well, the Arab world's in a different place now. We just have to reach out to them and we can work some things with the Arab world and we'll deal with the Palestinians. No, 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 and no. I can tell you that reaffirmed even in the last week as I have talked to leaders of the Arab community. There will be no advance and separate peace with the Arab world without the Palestinian process and Palestinian peace. Everybody needs to understand that. That is a hard reality. Secondly, I begin with the proposition that the Palestinians have major responsibilities to contribute to the process, some of which they have not fulfilled. On incitement, on capacity. I mean, we can run the list. But this is a U.S.-Israeli forum. So I want to talk about what the U.S. and Israel can do in answer to Jeff's really important and probing question. There's a basic choice that has to be made by Israelis, by the leadership of Israel, by all of you who support Israel and care about Israel. And that is, are there going to be continued settlements? Is there going to be a continued implementation of settlement policy? Or is there going to be separation and the creation of two states?
And this is where I'm going to conclude my first part of my update. I will also do an update on the alignment of Iran, Turkey, and Russia, which I think is incredibly significant prophetically. What's going on in Syria, kind of put it in context, and then also what's going on in Europe with regard to terror attacks and the essentially collapse of the European Union. I'll try to record that and have it up by noon on Monday. But this is a very prophetically significant week. I know I say that almost every week, but this one really, really is because of the things that are going on. The world is coming together against Israel and against the Jewish people. And we need, more than ever, to pay attention to what the scriptures say and to what's going on. God bless.